So, in the first part of this video, we talked a little tiny bit, or we kind of alluded to how industrial scale weapons changed the way that World War One is fought. So, I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. World War One is the first fully industrialized war. Now, there had been conflicts around the world that had seen the use of industrial scale weapons, seen mechanization, things like that. But World War One is the first where all sides have the ability to kill and destroy on a fully industrial scale, right? So I want to introduce some of these weapons so you get an idea of what we're talking about. The first of which is field artillery, commonly known as howitzers. Now, these are far different than, say, your 15th, 16th century Pirates of the Caribbean style cannons. Field artillery fires, obviously, in an arc, um, giving them greater range, also giving them the ability to fire over fortifications and defensive buildings. So this really renders the typical defense systems that people are used to essentially obsolete. Walls, for example, become useless. Forts and fortified cities become obsolete. Not only that, but thanks to industrialization, these weapons can be fired very, very quickly. They can also fire much larger, much more destructive projectiles at great distances. The average howitzer, kind of like what you're looking at here, could fire an explosive shell the size of a baby stroller, probably about 3 to 4 miles maximum. So the amount of destruction that each side is able to rain down on the heads of the other side is pretty dramatic compared to what was available only 100 years earlier. You also have the introduction of tanks during World War One. Tanks don't really become useful until the very end of the war, and even then, they're usually more dangerous to the person inside than to people outside. During World War One, tanks are generally just kind of used as movable shields to help infantry advance. It's not going to be until World War Two where the German army actually really starts to perfect how to integrate tanks and infantry troops together. And we'll talk about blitzkrieg in a later session. Airplanes make their debut as a weapon during World War One. Early on, just like tanks, they are mainly ineffective, usually flying over the battlefield only to scout positions and to allow decision makers the opportunity to see the entire battlefield. It's not until the later half of the war where really begin attaching weapons like machine guns to them, and they become an effective tool. You also see the introduction of the flamethrower during World War One. This is an extremely effective defensive tool, able to protect large areas of a trench or a fortified position. You also start to see the introduction of chemical weapons like poison gas. This is an American soldier who was caught in a mustard gas attack. Mustard gas is a chemical compound that, in its gaseous form, attaches and sinks into the human skin and causes massive chemical burns, like what you see here. There were also, other forms of poison gas, chlorine gas, tear gas, phosphorus gas, each one of them having different but equally devastating effects. By far, the most destructive weapon in World War One, though, is still the machine gun. Mother or necessity is the mother of invention, and with World War One on the horizon, all sides in this war begin to update and begin to modify their designs for machine guns. Probably the fastest and the most efficient was the British machine guns. These things could fire at a rate of between 3 to 4,000 rounds a minute. So this really makes industrial scale warfare deadly on an almost like genocidal level, right? And generally, these machine guns would then be housed in fortifications like this, concrete machine gun nests called pillboxes. The Germans were especially well known for these. And this would enable the operators of the machine gun to fire in multiple directions at once, as well as store food, supplies, ammunition, making them kind of like outposts in the middle of kind of no man's land where any sort of attack could be repulsed from any direction. Now, what all of this leads to is a need for new methods of fighting wars. Um, Previous methods of fighting wars with large battle formations and nice straight lines of engagement, all of that stuff goes out of the window after about the first 8 months of the war. Both sides, because of the weapons that we just looked at, lose in the tens of thousands of men a day because of the large scale destruction. So, what World War I turns into, at least in the European theater of war, is what we call trench warfare. And trench warfare is where both sides dig intricate tunnels and essentially ditches across the French countryside in order to protect them from the lethality of these new weapons. Um, Generally, what would happen is, as you can see, the artillery here in the rear of the trenches, the artillery would try to soften up enemy resistance ahead of an attack, usually firing shells down on enemy trenches for 2, 3, sometimes 4 to 6 hours before a large attack. Now, once the artillery stopped, the troops would mass in the front trench here, and upon being given a signal, usually a whistle or a bugle or something like that, they would go up over the top of the trench, and then they would try to sprint across this wide area known as no man's land, right? And you can draw your own conclusions as to why it was called no man's land. Now, no man's land oftentimes was littered with barbed wire, obstacles, things to slow down the advance of the enemy troops so that soldiers manning machine guns and rifles in the opposing trench could easily fire upon them and repulse the attack. Now, this, while moderately safer than fighting in large open fields with huge formations and straight battle lines, still is not an effective means of combat. This no man's land, as you can see on the diagram here, sometimes could be as short as a football field, but sometimes it could be as open as a mile wide. And that would mean that it would take troops somewhere between 3 to 4 minutes to cross it, the entire time being under fire from howitzers, enemy machine guns, flamethrowers, and every other form of projectile that could be thrown against them. So casualties were still incredibly high, even with the advent of trench warfare. Now, these trenches, as you can see from the map here, were pretty extensive. The Allies dug trenches basically from one side of France all the way to the other. These trenches ran all the way from the English Channel south through the river regions of France, stopping at the Swiss border because the Swiss were neutral, but then picking up again south of Switzerland and running all the way to the Mediterranean Ocean. Now, in a straight line flight, this is a little over 800 miles, but because of the constant moving back and forth of the trenches, as one trench is captured, the retreating forces would have to dig a new trench. They'd reattack, capture the original trench. The other forces would retreat back to their original trenches. And this would go on for 3.5 years. So somewhere between 25,000 to 30,000 miles of trenches are built all along the French countryside. And if you go visit a lot of these areas in France, especially around Verdun, which is the site of one of the largest battles of World War One, you can still visit national parks where the trenches are still in place. You can walk in the trenches. I know they do, a lot of guided tours of the French countryside where they'll take you to famous battle sites, places where World War One pillboxes are still in place today. Now, if you want, there are some links here for you to get a look at what exactly I'm talking about here. Now, all of these links are movie clips, but they're relative is a relative term, they're relatively accurate in terms of the strategy and the tactics and the formation that were being used at the time. So the first three links are all from prior to 1914. The first link is a Revolutionary War battle, the Battle of Camden. The other two are clips from the movie Gettysburg. And you can see in all of these clips the style and the tactics and kind of this idea of militarism where war should be kind of an honorary, it should be a gentlemanly thing where sides advance in nice straight lines, they get close to the enemy, and then after firing a couple of rounds things kind of turn to hand combat. Now, that is the style of war that many expected to fight in 1914. They expected to still move in large formations, still try to maneuver and outflank and surround their enemies. But because of things like howitzers and tanks and flamethrowers and machine guns, that style of war devolves into trench warfare, right? And if you want to click on the final three links there, you'll see kind of a better idea of what trench warfare looks like. Now, again, they're all movie clips, they're not actual footage, but I tried to pick ones that were as realistic to the conditions as possible. So definitely give them a look if you have time.